With multiple games releasing in the next few months from Nintendo, who are the developers likely to be on these titles? In this video, I want to look at the development groups, key support studios, and key producers, directors, and creative staff between 5 upcoming titles: Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, Star Fox, Rhythm Heaven, Splatoon Raiders, and Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. I want to see what we know and what might be likely. Now, I'm actually going to go in reverse order, which might seem odd, but I figure as the video dates out, it can be revisited more easily if the stuff that remains potentially relevant is at the front. So we're going to go with Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, which at the time of writing has not been dated and seems most likely to be in August or later. The headline studio is fairly obvious in this case. Intelligent Systems co-owns Fire Emblem and has been at the helm of every Fire Emblem game. However, on Three Houses, they did have a lot of support from Koei Tecmo, and the question is, will they be collaborating again? Now, that partnership struck me as rather successful, and given the explicit Three Houses links in this game, it seems, through the presence of Sothis and the sheer graphical ambition of the title, which seems like a big step up from past Fire Emblems, obviously, given that it's on the Switch too, I think there's quite a strong chance we could see Koei Tecmo playing a major role on this game. Of the top people from the group that supported on Three Houses, it's curious that for many of their most recent Koei Tecmo credits, those tend to be from 2022 or 2023. Relatively recent, I grant you, but since they're usually credited most years, it does suggest a fairly significant project that they are working on. And there were also several people who worked on recent Nintendo projects credited from the Fire Emblem Three Houses Koei Tecmo team, and specifically the kind of Nintendo projects that they've been working on since are things like Kirby Air Riders, Pokemon Pokopia, and so it strikes me that it's pretty likely that if there is a team at Koei Tecmo who are Nintendo facing, that while a chunk of that crew were working on Pokopia, there could well be another significant group working on Fortune's Weave. Therefore, I would, on the whole, expect to see Intelligent Systems and Koei Tecmo rejoining their efforts on Fortune's Weave. Now, the core producer for Nintendo will likely be Genki Okota, the director of multiple Fire Emblem and Xenoblade titles, including most recently Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and Fire Emblem Three Houses, albeit in collaboration with other creatives, he representing Nintendo and they representing Monolith and Intelligent Systems. He seems to be the new person in charge of Nintendo's 2 key RPG properties, and he certainly has a lengthy experience to match. This leaves a vacancy for the director's chair, but Three Houses co-director Toshiyuki Kasukihara remains likely to be involved, given that he did have support and assistant roles on Engage and Shadows in recent years. I'll also be interested to see if we can see any credit for Engage director Tsutomu Tei, who didn't work on Three Houses at all, although he did supervise Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes. If there's no sign of Tei, it would imply that there is still a secondary Intelligent Systems team working on, most likely, another Switch 2 Fire Emblem, although Tei's history also includes work on the occasional game from a different property, including Codename Steam and Advance Wars Days of Ruin. So it's also possible that they could have a secondary Intelligent Systems group working on something non-Fire Emblem, though on balance I think it's more likely that there will just be a second Fire Emblem game in the years ahead. At this point, I'd say it's 90% likely that Intelligent Systems will be the developers for Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave and that Genki Okota will be the producer, 70% likely that Koei Tecmo will be credited as supporting, and that Toshiyuki Kasukihara will be in a senior role, probably the director of the new game, although quite possibly a producer, whereas I think it's only a 30% chance that Tsutomu Tei is credited in a senior role, as I think it's likely that there will be a Splinter Fire Emblem team, although of course he might be credited as a special thanks. Moving up to Splatoon Raiders at the end of July. The core expectation again would be that this is an internal EPD project by the same group that has worked on Animal Crossing and Splatoon for many years, Group 5. I've speculated before that based on the credits of Splatoon 3 and Animal Crossing New Horizons, that the teams are no longer quite as interdependent for core art and programming staff as they might once have been, but that system of having 2 core development hubs who are prototyping the core essence of the Splatoon and the Animal Crossing games respectively, alongside a larger group staff that alternates between supporting the 2 hubs, well, that seems like a workable approach for not just Splatoon and Animal Crossing, but potentially Splatoon and a secondary Splatoon group if they have grown the staff to the point where the Splatoon hub could actually split into two and they've got enough supporting staff to work on two games for Splatoon alternately. So I think in this case, we could have some potential options for the core Splatoon devs, which are a little bit outside the people that we've seen so far. So who have we seen so far? Well, Shintaro Sato and Taita Inoue have been the directors since Splatoon 2, including on the DLC for both the Switch titles, but of course if Splatoon is indeed to expand, it would make sense to also introduce newer developers into leadership roles. Yoshitaro Fukuda and Kenji Matsumoto join the directing team on the Splatoon 3 expansion pass, and the next credit in seniority on the game design list, Yoshihiko Ito and Tadanori Sakata seem to be fairly focused on EPD5 titles. A curious figure on the Splatoon 3 credits, though, is Kenta Usui, who has for a long time been associated with the Yoshi property, starting as a course designer on the 1995 original and being involved all the way up to Crafted World in level design. We're going to get to Usui a lot more when we talk about Yoshi, but Usui has a very diverse portfolio over the years with titles all across Nintendo's IP, including Zelda, Wave Race, Good Job, and Donkey Kong. It's rather difficult, though perhaps not impossible, to imagine that he could have worked on Raiders and Mysterious Book concurrently, and while his deep experience with Yoshi makes me feel like Nintendo would want him there more than necessarily on Splatoon, he's also the kind of person who could be a very valuable person on Splatoon as a splinter group, either as a director or else a supervisor and producer shepherding the broadly less experienced Nintendo team. And we have seen this kind of cross-pollination of different team members before. For example, we can think of Koichi Hayashida, who came over from the 3D team where he was leading it to support the EPD10 group that was behind Mario Maker and then eventually on Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Another question that inevitably is being asked is whether there will be a support studio that has a big role on the new Splatoon game. Well, Bandai Namco Studios Singapore, now of course Nintendo Studios Singapore, supported a good deal on Splatoon 3, and it makes sense to me that they will do on this title too. Monolith Soft also have a history of supporting with Splatoon. It's even possible this title follows in the footsteps of top-down Zelda and Pikmin 3 Deluxe and is farmed out almost entirely, except for the key development team. It would obviously be a huge feather in Nintendo's cap if they were able to inaugurate a secondary development team for Splatoon outside Nintendo while keeping the core team intact. But to me, it doesn't feel enormously likely, and I think they will want to keep a close eye on the output of the Splatoon group. Therefore, I would say there's a 90% chance that EPD5 will be leading development, a 90% chance also that Shintaro Sato and or Sayota Inoue are credited on Splatoon Raiders. Just 70% of the Singapore team and or Monolith Soft receive at least a special thanks on the game, and that Yoshitaro Fukuda, Kenji Matsumoto, Yoshihiko Ito, and or Tadanori Sakata are directing. 30% that Yoshi's Kenta Usui is credited, which would be higher if it weren't for the fact that a Yoshi game is coming out so close to Splatoon Raiders, and while it's possible that he could be working on both, it feels a little bit of a stretch to me. Okay, let's talk Rhythm Heaven next. Rhythm Heaven Groove releases in early July, a decade and change after Megamix launched on 3DS. But as we saw with Tomodachi Life, Nintendo tend to keep the same people in post, and so we can look back to previous games to see who is likely to be leading this one. Masami Yone is a long-time director on the Rhythm Heaven series and was recently credited on 2024's Nintendo World Championships NES edition, so I could definitely see him returning. Takumi Hatakeyama, who worked on 2 prior Rhythm Heaven titles, was most recently a planner on the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass, and since that game wrapped up in 2023, that seems to be a reasonable point for a new Rhythm Heaven to be booted up. Series veteran Takafumi Masaoka also seems to be still at Nintendo, although the supervisor of all the previous games, Hiroshida Ida, still has yet to score another non-Rhythm Heaven credit, and so it's a little bit mysterious as to whether or not he's still around, although knowing Nintendo, let's face it, he probably is. Of course, a key question is whether Tsunku, I hope I'm saying that right, the Japanese vocalist behind previous Rhythm Heaven games, will return, and his blog seems to indicate strongly that he will, as he says he apologizes for keeping us waiting so long. Even the key production team seem likely to be similar, with Katsuya Yamano having worked on Tomodachi Life recently. Now, obviously, we're in an age where there is going to be a change in production teams across many major Nintendo titles, but in this case, I don't see any evidence, despite the decade-long gap, of any substantial interruption in the core team, and while I once worried that the team might be disbanded because it seemed like the Sakamoto group had gone to the wall, it now strikes me as likely that they were simply waiting for the chance to reconvene, which they seemingly did around 2024 after the Booster Course Pass and Nintendo World Championships were finished. Now, there's always the chance of some outside assistance with the development, of course, but I don't see at this stage it's obviously required. The only question I have is whether Yoshia Sakamoto would still be involved. In 2011 and 2015, Nintendo took the highly unusual step of crediting Sakamoto as a general producer, something they usually reserve for their EPD head Shinya Takahashi, or very occasionally Shigeru Miyamoto, as he was credited on Pikmin 4 and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, or Animal Crossing head Iguchi, basically something that is used when these very senior people kibitz on other properties. But Sakamoto has been on other series more recently, where he's been much more involved and he's been given the producer credit, as on Metroid Dread and Emio the Smiling Man. So quite what the logic of this general producer credit was, I'm not entirely sure, although perhaps it was to distinguish Sakamoto's involvement from Tsunku's, who of course was credited as a producer. At any rate, we know that Sakamoto was involved in Emio and Tomodachi Life in recent years, but the fact that he was nowhere to be seen in the 2026 Tomodachi Life Ask the Developer interviews and was talking about succession in the Ask the Developer interviews after 2024's Emio the Smiling Man makes me think he probably retired around his 65th birthday in 2025. If my hunch is right that this game booted up in 2024, well, he could still receive a special thanks credit, but I'm less sure I would expect to see him as producer, though I think it's likely he will receive some kind of credit, the special thanks being the obvious one, but we'll have to wait and see. This does raise the question of whether there will be another producer involved, and if so, I think a likely candidate could be EPD4's newest producer, Takayuki Shimomura, who shepherded Nintendo World Championship NES Edition, and whose star has been on the rise in terms of new games, as he was also involved with some of the DLC for Switch Sports. So all told, I think there's 90% chance that Tsunku is credited on Rhythm Heaven Groove, also that Masami Yone or Hiroshi Ida, or both, are credited on Rhythm Heaven Groove. I think there's 90% that Takayama or Takafumi Masaoka, or both, are credited on the game as well. I think it's just 70% that Sakamoto will receive some kind of credit, but that does include a special thanks. 50% that Takayuki Shimomura is credited on Rhythm Heaven Groove, and only 30% that Sakamoto will be credited as a producer or general producer for the game. Still possible, but it does feel like we're getting to the point where it might be someone else's problem, as he was clearly in 2024 looking to move on. Okay, here's the big one for many, Star Fox. I've discussed previously some speculation, including the names of specific producers I expect to see, and so I don't really want to change or replace those forecasts currently, and I would refer you to some degree to those videos for more detailed deep dives, but there are a few things to highlight that have come out in recent weeks, and things that I think we should probably focus on in terms of trying to anticipate who might be developing Star Fox. I still think on the whole that it's likely to be an internal team, but there are certainly things that would indicate other possibilities. So firstly, let's talk talking. I've had many comments to the effect that the studio must be a Western one, because the characters' mouths move in an English pattern and in line with the rhythms of the English language. Now, I think this does carry some weight, but also they have evidently been experimenting with some kind of motion capture technology that allows character animations to mirror human expressions for the use in game chat. Now, obviously, they did not use game chat AR filters for the game itself when they were animating it, but it does strike me that if they recorded the performance and used this both as a model for the game and as a way to experiment with the efficacy of their game chat mode, then it might have made a stronger start, especially if they aspired to have the lip movements be adaptable to other languages as well, something which we might not know at the moment. It's clearly conceivable that they could have outsourced this technology, but why would Nintendo not want this experience at the heart of their team, whether in Nintendo Pictures or elsewhere? Having said that, there would be two obvious places where this could be of use. Next Level Games in Canada and Retro Studios in Austin, Texas, USA are English-speaking studios with great track records of delivering graphically top-shelf properties. Both have experience in sci-fi visuals in the last decade, and it seems likely that Metroid Prime 4 also had to use a good deal of motion capture as part of its development, so it would make sense to ameliorate costs. I also have a separate video coming out exploring the potential of a secondary Retro Studios team that could have been working during Metroid Prime 4 on small side projects, possibly including bringing in a number of external studios to support, but I'll save this for another video. For now, the possibilities are extremely diffused, and I've seen people name almost any studio you can think of, including Pikmin assistance teams, Aiting, and rather improbably to my mind, Ubisoft, on account of Starlink Battle for Atlas, which they did develop. I don't think Nintendo want to tie the fortunes of a big revived character to the uncertain fates of a third-party studio like Ubisoft, although to be fair, they've made dicier partnerships work before. The fact is, lots of people could be involved on Star Fox, especially on an assistance basis, but Nintendo has an incredible history of palming the franchise off to all and sundry. At this point, though, I really think that at this point in Nintendo's life, they have an historic opportunity to build a core Star Fox team, and so I maintain that a core EPT group is the overwhelming likelihood to be the leading development group, as I speculated previously, but possibly with the heavy involvement of a small handful of developers, such as, for example, EPD9's Oyagi. All told, then, I'd say 30% likely it could be Retro Studios or Next Level Games affiliated individuals being credited in Star Fox on some capacity, but 10% each that Retro the lead developers, Next Level Games, Ubisoft, Aiting, Koei Tecmo, and Monolith Soft are the lead developers. I just think the field is so wide on this one that there's really nobody that I would particularly give the nod to over a core EPD team. So let's end with a game that is the most imminent, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. With Yoshi's longtime producer Takashi Tezuka retiring as an executive, these credits will be especially interesting in allowing us to see the trajectory of forthcoming games, although it may well be a few years before we truly see how the game studio is setting up after Tezuka. The bigger question I have is what will happen to the aforementioned Kenta Usui. Usui feels like he's ideally placed to lead the Yoshi property, having been involved in it for so long. But if his secondment to the Splatoon team for Splatoon 3 is not just a brief affair, but a permanent situation, then his involvement feels far less secure for Yoshi and the Mysterious Book. I will be interested to see who takes the senior developer's role, and therefore I think this might give an indication of who is actually taking over at EPD10. And I think one person we want to keep an eye on is Koichi Hayashida, who would be an obvious candidate given that he was previously a senior producer as the leader of EPD8, the Tokyo team that worked on Super Mario Odyssey and many other 3D Mario games. But of course, he's been shadowing EPD10 for a while, and so it seems like he would be an obvious place to step in to Tezuka's shoes. As regard developers, Goodfeel seemed the most likely for multiple reasons. They worked not just on the two prior Yoshi games, but also on Wario Land Shake It, Kirby's Epic Yarn, and Princess Peach Showtime, showing a consistent commitment to off-kilter platform action with an artistic edge and perhaps a younger focus. Moreover, the announcement of Unreal Engine 5 being used, given that Yoshi's Crafted World was based on UE4, feels like a plausible link. The only real reason for doubt is development times. Goodfeel released Yoshi's Crafted World in 2019, but it was 5 years before their next Nintendo offering, Princess Peach Showtime. However, in that period, they created an original project, Bakaru, so this would make it more plausible that they might finish Yoshi, especially if it's a smaller game, in the time period since Princess Peach wrapped up. The only other likely option is a beefed up internal team at the historic developers of 2D Mario and Yoshi, the aforementioned EPD Group 10. And I actually think it feels decently likely that Nintendo will eventually want to increase their EPD 10 grouping and expand it out, since currently they have quite a lot under their belt, including not just Yoshi and Mario, but also the Pikmin franchise. But I'm not sure at this stage that this is the opportunity they will take, and Yoshi for a very long time has been something that has been developed outside of the core EPD grouping. Therefore, I'd say it's 90% likely that Goodfeel are involved in developing Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, and that Takashi Tezuka will be credited, even if just as a special thanks, but only 70% likely that Kenta Usui will be credited on Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, and 50% that Koichi Hayashida will be credited on the game as well. At any rate, those are my thoughts, but do let me know in the comments if you've got any other observations. And thank you so much for watching. Please do consider checking out the Patreon for early, ad-free and exclusive content. And I will just say thank you again, and I'll see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.